Well, you've all heard of the statement, a day late and a dollar short. A day late and a dollar short. Sometimes I think that applies to me. I don't know how many times I've gone into an antique shop and looking for insulators, and they'll say, you know what, we had this beautiful purple insulator from Canada that was sold yesterday. You've been here yesterday, you could have had it. Yesterday a lady came in and bought all of our insulators. I feel like I'm a day late and a dollar short sometimes. And yet today I'm ahead of the curve because we're in John the 11th chapter looking at Jesus raising Lazarus. Now why I say I'm ahead of the curve is because next Sunday, April 4th, is what we call Easter Sunday. It's Resurrection Sunday. And if you can have a resurrection sermon, it would fit perfectly on the 4th rather than today. And I'm afraid that people are going to come next week and they'll say, I thought we were going to hear a resurrection sermon. And we'd say, well, you should have been here last week. We had a good one last week on resurrection. So actually, I'm in John the 11th chapter. And I don't have to talk about the resurrection totally yet. I mean, last week I was in the 11th chapter and I looked at Martha and her marvelous faith. And what's revealed after Jesus raises Lazarus is how some cannot believe. How we have this unbelievable disbelief. And that's what I think I'll focus on today so we can come back and circle around and look at Jesus raising Lazarus next Sunday. So let's go to John 11th chapter. We're going to begin reading here in verse 38. So Jesus again, being deeply moved within, came to the tomb. Now it was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, remove the stone. Martha, the sister of the deceased, said to him, Lord, by this time there'll be a stench, for he has been dead 4 days. Jesus said to her, did I not say to you that if you believe, you'll see the glory of God? So they removed the stone. Then Jesus raised his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but because of the people standing around, I said it, so that they may believe that you sent me. When he said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth! The man who had died came forth, bound hand and foot with wrappings, and his face was wrapped around with a cloth. Jesus said to them, unbind him and let him go. Therefore, many of the Jews who came to Mary and saw what he had done believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them the things which Jesus had done. Therefore the chief priests and the Pharisees convened a council and were saying, what are we doing? For this man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, all men will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all, nor do you take into account that it is expedient for you that one man die for the people and the whole nation not perish. Now, he did not say this on his own initiative, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus was going to die for the nation. And not for the nation only, but in order that he might also gather together into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. So from that day on, they planned together to kill him. Therefore, Jesus no longer continued to walk publicly among the Jews, but went away from there to the country near the wilderness, into a city called Ephraim, and there he stayed with the disciples. Now, the Passover of the Jews was near, and many went up to Jerusalem out of the country before the Passover to purify themselves. So they were seeking for Jesus, and were saying to one another as they stood in the temple, what do you think? That he will not come to the feast at all? Now the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was to report it so they might seize him. Now, what I want to focus on is just how unbelievable unbelief is. This is amazing. To see the Jewish leaders' response is amazing. So Jesus is there at the tomb, and he tells them to remove the stone. And that's an interesting thing. Remove the stone. Jesus had the power to remove the stone himself. You know, he had all power. Why didn't he just remove the stone? It's amazing that Jesus doesn't do for us what we could do for ourselves. Any man could remove the stone. We don't need the power of God to remove the stone. Jesus is not a carnival act. He's not doing these just to impress people. He was there to try to point them to something greater. Remove the stone. You know, when Jesus was resurrected, the stone was rolled away. Now, in this case, here in John 11, it's rolled away to let Lazarus out. In Jesus' case, it was to let us in, so we could see the empty tomb and see that Jesus wasn't there. And so Martha, Lazarus' sister, she objects. She says, well, you can't do that because it's going to smell. It's going to stink. You know, the old King James Version, behold, he still stinketh. He's been dead for 4 days. He smells. I've not been around that many dead bodies, but I've been around enough to know that decomposition happens fairly rapidly, and dead bodies stink. It is a smell that you will recognize and you won't forget. Every once in a while on a television show where you have these detectives come in and the body's been discovered after it's been dead for several days, you know, they'll actually pretend that it stinks. They'll show in their face, oh, this is quite an odor here. And I think, well, that's good acting, because if they were really there and they really found this body, it would smell and it would have this distinctive, terrible stench. And that's what Martha is objecting. She says, wait, if you open that door, it's going to smell. And Jesus reminds her, didn't I tell you that if you believed, you'd see the glory of God? Now, that's what he told her back in verse 4. Now, back in verse 4, messengers had come to Jesus to tell him about Lazarus being sick. And then in verse 4, he must have sent those messengers back with that message. This is not a sickness that will end in death, but it will bring about the glory of God. And these girls, the sisters, Mary and Martha, must have just hung on to that idea that, oh, he's not going to die. And when he does die, they think, well, if Jesus was here, he wouldn't have died. And that's what they'd say to Jesus. If he'd been here, he wouldn't have died. And so this is to show the glory of God. And Jesus prays to God, thanks him for answering this prayer before it even happens. And then he asks Lazarus, he commands Lazarus to come forth. I try to visualize this sometimes. I don't know what that must have looked like. He's bound, it says hand and feet, his feet are bound together. Did he hop out of the tomb? Did he just shuffle out of the tomb? In my mind, I almost visualize him just coming up, floating out of the tomb and coming there in front of Jesus. And he says, unwrap him, let him go. Now, we're going to revisit this next week, and I want to talk about the resurrection and some of the unique details of this story that are really great. But this morning, I want us to see two immediate results that happened from the miracle. One is, verse 45, some of the Jews who'd come with Mary saw this miracle and believed. And secondly, some saw this and they went back and reported it to the Pharisees. And the Pharisees and the chief priests, they convene a council. And they were saying, what are we going to do? For this man is performing many signs. Actually, this is the 7th sign that we are going to see in the Gospel of John. This is the last sign other than the resurrection that we'll see in the Gospel of John. And John uses the word signs a lot. We know signs. Somebody put up a sign out here in front of our building the other day. It says county offices, and it directs them to go up a few more blocks. Now, if you saw that sign and you came into our parking lot expecting this to be one of the county offices, you didn't understand the idea and concept of a sign. A sign points you somewhere. And when we're looking at these as signs, Jesus is pointing us to something different. He's pointing us to something else. He says, I'm the bread of life. Then he feeds 5,000 people. He says, I am the light of the world. Then he heals a blind man. Jesus is pointing to something greater. This is a sign. But the thing here that I want us to notice, the incredible thing is, these unbelievers express absolutely no doubt in the legitimacy of this miracle. Did you get that? They don't doubt at all that Jesus is doing miracles. They're not asking, oh, are these real miracles? Is he really doing this? No, they're not doing that at all. What they're saying is, how are we going to stop him? This is the unbelievable part of unbelief. Sometimes skeptics will say, you show me a miracle and I'll believe. You give me the evidence and I'll believe. But that is just absolutely not true. Even if they saw a legitimate, genuine miracle, they're still going to doubt. They're still going to look for a naturalistic explanation, a materialistic explanation. They'll find some other reason for not believing. Apologists go to college campuses, and I've mentioned this before. They go to college campuses and talk about reasons for believing. And usually they have a question and answer period after their presentation, and they'll usually get some atheists come and give in some pushback. And one of the questions they often ask these atheists is, if we could show you without a doubt that Christianity were true, would you believe? And the answer is, well, no. It's not a lack of evidence. It's not a lack of evidence at all. There's sites on our internet that say, they're why I'm not a Christian, or why I left Christianity. And the amazing thing for me is that nearly half of the reasons for them leaving have nothing to do with what was true or not. It has to do with the way they felt. It has to do with, well, I didn't like Christians, or I don't like the church, or this happened to me. It has nothing to do with truth at all. There's another Lazarus in the New Testament. Not this Lazarus, another Lazarus in Luke, the 16th chapter. It's a story of a rich man and Lazarus. And I hope that we all are familiar with the story, because I just want to come to the end of the story where the rich man wants Lazarus to come over and at least dip his finger in some water and touch his tongue with some water. And he says, that can't happen. He said, well, then at least send him back to my brothers. And verse 27, he said, I beg you, Father, that you send him to my father's house. For I have 5 brothers, in order that he may warn them, so they will not come to this place of torment. But Abraham said, they have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. But he said, no, Father Abraham. But if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent. But he said to them, if they do not believe Moses, they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be persuaded, even if someone rises from the dead. When I was younger, I was sympathetic to this rich man's position. I thought, certainly, if God sent someone from the dead, if something special were sent from God, they would believe. But as I've gotten older, I realize that that's just not going to happen. Not even if someone comes back from the dead will they believe. In Matthew, the 28th chapter, Jesus is resurrected, and he comes to the disciples and shows himself. And in chapter 8 of Matthew, verse 17, it says that some were doubtful. For crying out loud. Jesus, who they saw days before, being crucified, now they see alive, and still some were doubtful. Here's an important point. Unbelief is not based on insufficient evidence. Did you get that? Unbelief is not based on insufficient evidence. If there was any miracle that Jesus could have performed that would cause these people to bow down at his feet and worship him, raising Lazarus from the dead would have been one of those. But even though they know that Jesus has done this miracle, and they say he's done many signs, because, see, they haven't just seen this miracle, they've seen the other miracles as well. And even when they saw those miracles, they never doubted that a true miracle was done. They just didn't want to believe what was done. There's this unbelief and unbelief. In John, the 11th chapter, my Bible's getting wind blown all around. Let me try to get back to John 11. In verse 48, it says, if we let him go on like this, all men will believe in him. Well, that's telling, isn't it? If we let him go on like this, everybody's going to believe. You know, we have the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Luke, we're reading the Gospel of John. You could almost write a gospel of unbelievers, a gospel of the enemies of Jesus, and they could tell you, they testify all these good things. This is a man who's a friend with tax collectors and sinners. He even eats with them when he's on the cross. This man saved others, but he can't save himself. I mean, they are testifying over and over to the truth of Jesus. This man claims to be God. There are so many signs. In chapter 10, verse 32, they pick up stones to stone him, and Jesus answers, I showed you many good works from the Father. For which of them are you stoning me? The Jews answered him, for a good work we do not stone you, but for blasphemy, and because you, being a man, make yourself out to be God. You know, if you had a gospel according to the enemies of Jesus, I mean, they tell us all kinds of good things about him. They would tell us about the resurrection of Lazarus. They would see that. And they say, you know, if he goes on unstopped, he'll convert the world. But here's the real problem. In verse 48, if we continue, he says, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. If this man goes on unstopped, we're going to lose our position. We're going to lose our status. Now, they had a tremendously profitable business with the temple. These men were making a lot of money off of religion. They were making all kinds. The things that are really ironic about this, they're worried that the Romans are going to come in and take their place and their nation away from them. Now, what's ironic about this is John, the Gospel of John, is written probably around 90 to 100 A.D. We know what happened in 70 A.D., don't we? 20 years before this, that's exactly what happened. What these guys were worried about happened. They lost their place and they lost their nation. The Romans came in and not only destroyed the temple, they destroyed Jerusalem. They totally destroyed it. In fact, it's hard to imagine that these men who are plotting against Jesus survive that. These men are most likely dead by now. They went through all of this effort to put Jesus to death. They went through all this effort to conspire against him for a couple of more good years, because that's all they were going to have left, is a few more good years. Caiaphas is a smart guy. You know, don't sell these guys short. He is smart. He is cunning. He is shrewd. He's a calculating politician. He is wealthy. He's very rich. And he is arrogant. He tells all these people, you don't know nothing. You guys are stupid. You don't know a thing. He says that in verse 49, you don't know nothing. And then he says, nor do you take, verse 50, nor do you take into account that it's expedient for you that one man die for the people and the whole nation not perish. the irony of verse 50 is this. Caiaphas is prophesying the substitutionary atonement of Jesus. Caiaphas is preaching the gospel unknowingly. And that's what John brings out. He doesn't even know what he's saying. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's talking about Jesus dying not only for the nation, but for the entire world, for all those who are his people. And but he says here, and it's very telling, verse 50, it's expedient for you. He's talking to these other religious leaders. It's expedient for you. He's appealing to their self-interest, to their love, to the love of themselves. They love themselves. They love their status. They love their position. They love their comfort. You know, the reason that people don't believe is not the lack of evidence, but they just love their ways. Why change? I don't want to change. They're lovers of self, it says in the Bible. They're lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God. In the last chapter of the Bible, Revelation 22, verse 15, they're lovers of falsehood. They love lies. You know, it's interesting. I came across this week. It's by Niles Eldredge, who's a famous paleontologist, who's a famous evolutionist. He was a colleague of Stephen Jay Gould, and he writes about evolution. He says, no wonder paleontologists shied away from evolution for so long. It never seems to happen. Assiduous collecting of cliff faces yields zigzags, minor oscillations, and the very occasional slight accumulation of change over millions of years at a rate too slow to account for all the prodigious change that has occurred in evolutionary history. When we do see the introduction of evolutionary novelty, it usually shows up with bang, and often with no firm evidence that the fossils did not evolve elsewhere. Evolution cannot forever be going on somewhere else, yet that's how the fossil record has struck many a forlorn paleontologist looking to learn something about evolution. What he's saying is, there's so many paleontologists who believe in evolution, but the evidence is not there. I knew a guy that was a geologist, and he says that geologists, they think, well, there's this big gap between what we see and evolution, but we want to believe in evolution, so we make this big leap, and we say, well, you know, the paleontologists, they make up for that leap. They fill in the gaps for us. And you go to the paleontologists, say, well, the biologists, they make up the leap for us. And they go to, a few years back, a couple years ago, John Burnham, PhD in chemistry, university professor, came to talk to us about why he believes. And when he talked about chemistry, he says there's a huge chasm, a huge gap between what they know about life and life itself. They can't explain how we got here. They can't explain how life begins. They can't explain any of this. I want to read a comment about this. I hate to read things, but I want to read this. I thought this guy said it really well. He says, why do people cling so tenaciously to a theory so deeply troubled by a lack of evidence? The kind of evidence that, according to the theory, ought to be abundant everywhere one looks in the fossil record, in the genetic structure of life, in embryology, and so on. The reason is that they love evolution. They love falsehood. They love it. They love it because they love themselves, and they fear the loss of themselves as they know themselves if they give themselves up to God. Evolution keeps God at bay, and so they love evolution. They don't put it to themselves that way at all, of course, but then neither did the Sanhedrin. No one stood up in that meeting and said, forget the people and forget the miracles and forget what God may be doing in our midst. All that matters is that we, here in this room, preserve our own privileges and positions. But that's what the real motive that lay beneath their action, and from time to time they let slip what they were really thinking, just as they did here when they said our place and our nation, and when Caiaphas said, it is better for you. You know, there's another evolutionist. He's a Harvard genetics professor, Richard Lewontin, and he writes something interesting. He says, we take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its promises, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It's not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the natural world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our pre-commitment to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. He's saying, you know, we are materialists, we are atheists, not because of this overwhelming amount of evidence, but because we don't want a divine foot in the door. We don't want to even consider God as being real. I'm not talking about atheists. I'm telling you what they said themselves. Sometimes I hear, though, you know, atheists are just as good as Christians, so I don't know why you guys are complaining. They have a, you know, they can be just as moral as you are. And I agree that there are some atheists that are great moral people. Not only can they be just as good as us, they can be just as bad as us. You know, there's no argument here at all, because we're not arguing that you have to be good enough to get to heaven. That's not our argument at all. In fact, Christianity is first and foremost not an ethical standard. It's not an ethical relationship. It's a matter of faith. We're not saying that Christians are better than anyone else. Christians aren't saying that at all. We're saying that we're just as bad as everyone else, that we have the same selfish self-interest that everybody else has. You know, it's not arrogance to say that atheists are self-centered. It's a recognition I have that same self-centeredness. Sin is self-centeredness. What we're saying is that we recognize the evidence and it's overwhelming. And the unbeliever says, in spite of whatever evidence you show me, I will not believe. The unbelief is just unbelievable. As one guy said, I just don't have enough faith to be an atheist. And so now the goal is to destroy Jesus, to destroy Christianity. And even today we have unbelievers who try to shame us into silence, and it just will not happen. And then in verse 53 of John 11, so from that day on they planned together to kill him. They'd been planning since chapter 5 to kill Jesus. Chapter 5 verse 18, chapter 7 verse 11, chapter 7 verse 30, chapter 8 verse 40, chapter 8 verse 59, chapter 10 verse 31, chapter 10 39. They had been trying to kill Jesus for a long time, but this is the first time that they're doing it together. They're united on this. You know, one thing that happens to people is every time you let an opportunity to believe pass you by, your heart becomes a little bit hardened. And the callousness of this group of people, the hardness of their heart, is just so amazing. Their unbelief is due to the hardness of their heart, not the lack of evidences. So we see in this this miracle, and we'll look at a little bit further next week, two results. The one is that the group of Jews went and saw this and went and celebrated with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And the second group convened a council to calculate how to kill him. Unbelief is amazing. I want to just close with one passage from the book of Hebrews. Steve recently took us through the book of Hebrews. In Hebrews, the 3rd chapter, verse 15, there's a verse 13, there's a warning for us. Verse 12, I'll get it right. Take care, brethren, that there not be in any one of you an evil, unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God. You know, this little bit of unbelief can enter into our hearts and start to harden our hearts if we're not careful. And he says, but encourage one another day after day as long as it's still called today, so that none of you will be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. For we have become partakers of Christ if we hold firm and hold fast the beginning of our assurance firm until the end. Well, that's why we're here today. Encourage one another. Don't give up. Hold on to that faith. There's something very unbelievable in unbelief. They don't need evidence, because even if the evidence was there, they're still not going to believe. We believe even though we have not seen the incredible evidences they have. Jesus said we'll be blessed for this. Well, may God bless you today. Hope you have a wonderful week.